The door didn't open. Under the glow of crystal chandeliers and champagne laughter, Victoria Whitmore stepped forward and blocked Chloe Bennett's path, her voice calm, precise, and loud enough for everyone to hear. This house is not for outsiders. Behind Chloe, 2 6-year-old children stood in the winter cold. Inside, guests turned. No one intervened. Sebastian Whitmore said nothing. Chloe didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply nodded while the truth far heavier than the house behind that door remained entirely unknown to them. If you believe dignity should never depend on wealth or approval, stay with this story until the end. And before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Subscribe if you value stories where silence carries more power than noise. Chloe Bennett did not rush when she walked away that night. She never did. Even with the cold pressing through her coat and the small hands of Ethan and Ella tucked tightly into hers, her steps remained measured, steady, deliberate, almost detached from the sharpness of what had just happened. Anyone watching might have mistaken it for calm. It wasn't calm. It was control. She had learned that long ago. The car was already waiting at the curb. Not a luxury statement, not something that invited attention, just a dark, unremarkable sedan that blended easily into the quiet affluence of the neighborhood. The driver stepped out, opened the door without a word. Chloe helped Ella in first, then Ethan. She slid in beside them, pulling the door closed with a soft final click that felt heavier than it sounded. Inside, silence settled. Ella leaned into her side. "Mom, did we do something wrong?" The question hung there, fragile and precise. Chloe looked down at her daughter, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. Her voice, when it came, was gentle even. "No," she said. "You didn't." Ethan didn't speak. He rarely did when something mattered. He just watched his eyes moving between his mother's face and the window, as if trying to understand something that hadn't been explained. Chloe noticed. She always noticed. Her hand rested lightly over his. Not tight, not reassuring in an obvious way. Just there. The car pulled away. Behind them, the Whitmore house remained lit, bright warm, filled with people who had just witnessed something they would not speak about directly, but would remember in fragments, in glances, in quiet conversations, days later. Chloe didn't look back. She never looked back when something was finished. By the time they reached the apartment, the children were quiet with exhaustion more than emotion. It wasn't large, not compared to the homes they had just left behind, but it was clean, ordered, intentional. Everything in Chloe's life had a place. Coats were hung, shoes aligned, Ella's small scarf folded and placed on the entry table. These were not habits born from preference. They were systems, small structures that kept the world predictable. Ethan went to the living room without being told. Ella followed slower. Chloe stayed by the door for a moment longer. Then she reached into her bag. Her phone. 3 new notifications. She didn't open them immediately. Instead, she walked to the kitchen, placed the phone face down on the counter, and poured a glass of water. She drank it slowly, as if nothing urgent existed, as if the evening had not shifted something fundamental. Only when the glass was empty did she turn the phone over. One message from Sebastian. No subject, no apology, just a single line. "We need to talk tomorrow." Chloe read it once. Then she locked the screen. To anyone outside Chloe Bennett's life, appeared modest, quietly functional, almost invisible within the circles the Whitmore family moved through. She worked as an independent financial consultant. That was the phrase she used. It was vague enough to avoid questions, professional enough to end most conversations before they began. She worked from home. She didn't attend events unless required. She didn't display wealth. In a world that measured worth through visibility, Chloe had mastered the opposite. She reduced herself, not in reality, only in appearance. Mornings in Chloe's home followed a rhythm that never changed. 6:00 a.m. she woke, not with an alarm. She didn't need one. By 6:10, she was already at the kitchen counter, laptop open, reviewing numbers that moved across the screen with quiet precision. Global markets currency shifts silent transactions that happened while most of the world slept. Her face revealed nothing. 6:45 breakfast. Ethan liked consistency. Toast eggs always the same plate. Ella preferred variation but accepted routine without complaint. Chloe adapted without discussion. 7:30 coats, bags, shoes. 8:00 school drop-off. She never missed it. Not once. The school itself was not extraordinary, but it was stable. That mattered more. Other parents talked about travel, about investments, about things Chloe could easily surpass if she chose to participate. She didn't. She listened when spoken to. She responded when necessary. She never offered more. There was a distance to her, not cold but controlled, as if every word passed through a filter before it was allowed to exist. Some found it unsettling. Others dismissed it as insignificance. Both were wrong. Sebastian Whitmore had once admired that restraint. Years ago, when everything was still forming, when success had not yet hardened into expectation, he had described Chloe as grounded. She had balanced him. Where he was ambitious, she was precise. Where he reacted, she observed. But ambition, once rewarded, tends to reshape memory. Now, in the world, Sebastian occupied corner offices, polished conference rooms, conversations layered with status and subtle competition. Chloe's restraint no longer read as strength. It read as absence, or worse, as inadequacy. He didn't say it directly. He didn't need to. The shift showed in smaller ways, in how he introduced her. This is Chloe. No elaboration, no context. And how he stood beside her at events close enough to maintain appearance distant enough to signal separation. And how he stopped asking questions about her work. At some point, he had decided it didn't matter. The Whitmore family noticed long before he did. Victoria Whitmore especially. She had built her life around structure, perception, and control. Not loud control, the kind that announced itself, but quiet, strategic influence that shaped outcomes before anyone realized they had been guided. To her, Chloe had always been an inconsistency. Not openly problematic, just undefined. And in Victoria's world, anything undefined was a liability. She doesn't contribute. Victoria had once said, not directly to Chloe, but close enough that the words were meant to carry. It wasn't entirely about money. It was about visibility, about presence, about the ability to reinforce the image the Whitmore name required. Chloe did none of that. She attended, but did not engage. She listened, but did not align. She existed beside them, not within them. And over time, that became unacceptable. Chloe was aware of all of it, every glance, every pause. Every conversation that shifted tone when she entered a room. She didn't confront it. She documented it. Not emotionally, systematically. Emails were archived, messages saved, dates noted. Conversations summarized in a private digital file, time-stamped, categorized, cross-referenced. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. Though for what, no one, not even Sebastian, had ever asked. Back in the apartment later that night, Chloe sat at her desk. The children were asleep. The city outside had quieted into the kind of stillness that allowed thoughts to surface clearly. Her laptop screen glowed softly in the dark. She opened a folder, inside rows of files, names, dates, threads of communication that on their own seemed insignificant, but together formed a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. She added a new entry. December 31st, 11:42 p.m. A brief description. No emotion, just facts. Denied entry to Whitmore residence in presence of witnesses. Children present. Statement made by Victoria Whitmore. This house is not for outsiders. Sebastian Whitmore present. No intervention. She paused, not because she was unsure, but because she understood exactly what this meant. Then she saved the file, closed the laptop, and sat there for a moment longer in complete stillness. Chloe Bennett did not react to humiliation the way most people did. She didn't defend. She didn't argue. She didn't escalate. She absorbed. She recorded. And when the time came, she would act. But not tonight. Not yet. Long before the Whitmore name ever touched her life, Chloe Bennett had already learned how to exist without being seen. It was not a skill she chose. It was one she inherited. Chicago winter. A small apartment above a laundromat that never truly slept. The constant hum of machines below blended with the distant noise of traffic, creating a kind of background rhythm that Chloe would later associate with stability. Not comfort, just predictability. Her mother, Laura Bennett, worked 2 jobs. Day shifts at a medical billing office. Night shifts, cleaning commercial buildings downtown. There were no complaints, not spoken aloud. But exhaustion had a way of settling into posture, into silence, into the spaces between words. Chloe learned early not to ask for things. Not because she wasn't allowed, but because she understood the cost before she understood the concept of money. Dinner was simple, routine, efficient. Homework was done at the kitchen table while her mother reviewed paperwork or simply sat eyes closed, gathering enough energy to stand again. There was no room for distraction, no room for error. Chloe adapted. By the time she was 12, she'd already developed habits that most adults struggled to maintain. She tracked expenses not because anyone told her to, but because she noticed patterns. Utility bills fluctuating, grocery totals rising, rent always fixed, always looming. Numbers made sense. They behaved, unlike people. She found comfort there. Not emotional comfort, something quieter than that. A sense that if she paid attention closely enough, nothing would surprise her. School was not difficult for Chloe. It was structured, predictable. If she followed the rules, the outcome was clear. She excelled not loudly, not competitively, but with a consistency that teachers described as remarkable, and classmates often overlooked. She didn't correct them. Being overlooked had advantages. It allowed her to observe without interruption, to understand without being drawn into the complications that came with attention. When the acceptance letter arrived from Columbia University, her mother didn't speak for a long time. She just held the envelope in her hands, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. "You should go," Laura finally said. "Not if you want to. Not we'll figure it out. Just, you should go." Chloe nodded. There was never another option. New York introduced a different kind of noise. Not the constant hum of machinery, but the layered, shifting energy of ambition. People moving with purpose. Conversations happening at a pace that assumed you were already behind. Chloe adjusted. She always did. At Columbia, she studied finance. Not because it was prestigious, because it was precise. Markets followed logic complex, sometimes irrational on the surface, but ultimately driven by patterns that could be understood if you looked long enough. She looked longer than most. It was during her second year that someone noticed. Not in a classroom, not through grades, but through a paper. She had written an analysis of emerging markets that didn't just describe trends, but predicted movements with uncomfortable accuracy. The email came without introduction. No signature she recognized. Just a request, "We'd like to meet." The meeting did not take place on campus. It wasn't public. It wasn't even particularly formal. A quiet office, minimal branding. No indication of what the organization actually was. The man who spoke to her introduced himself simply as Martin Hale. No company name, no title. He asked questions. Not about her background, not about her achievements, but about how she thought. Why she made certain assumptions. What she did when data conflicted. Chloe answered. Clearly, directly, without trying to impress. She didn't need to. What Martin Hale represented was not something Chloe could easily explain later. It wasn't a firm in the traditional sense. It didn't advertise. It didn't recruit publicly. It operated through layers, private capital, global investment structures that existed beyond the visibility of standard financial systems. A network more than a company. And it had noticed her. Chloe began working with him quietly. Internship at first, then something more permanent. The work was demanding, but not in the way most jobs were. There were no fixed hours, no clear boundaries, only expectations. Accuracy, discretion, consistency. She met all 3. It was also where the first structure of what would later become her financial reality began to take form. Not suddenly, not dramatically, gradually. Trust allocations, investment positions, equity distributions that at the time seemed theoretical. Chloe didn't question it. She understood enough to know that visibility was not part of the system. Ownership existed. Recognition did not. She met Sebastian Whitmore in her final year. Not through finance, not through work, but through something far more ordinary. A mutual acquaintance, a small gathering, a conversation that began without intention. Sebastian was different then. Ambitious, yes, but not yet defined by it. He spoke openly, listened actively. He asked Chloe what she studied and actually waited for the answer. That alone set him apart. Their relationship developed without resistance, at least not initially. Sebastian admired her focus, her ability to remain steady when others reacted. He described her as clear. It was a compliment he meant. Chloe didn't correct him. When they married, Sebastian was still building his career. Long hours, uncertain outcomes. Chloe supported him, not visibly, not in ways that could be easily pointed to, but in structure, in stability, in the quiet consistency that allowed him to focus outward while she maintained everything else. The Whitmore family had reservations from the beginning. Not openly hostile, not at first, but measured, evaluative. Victoria Whitmore especially approached Chloe the way one might assess a contract, carefully looking for gaps, inconsistencies, risks. "What does your family do?" Victoria had asked during their first formal dinner. "My mother works in medical billing," Chloe replied. A pause, subtle but present. "And your father? He's not involved." Victoria nodded, not disapproving, just noting. Chloe recognized the shift immediately. She didn't react. She simply adjusted her expectations. Over time, those small pauses became patterns. Questions that sounded polite but carried weight. Observations framed as concern. Suggestions that Chloe might feel more comfortable if she became more involved in certain social circles. Chloe declined. Always politely, always without explanation. Sebastian noticed, but only at the surface level. "They just want to get to know you," he would say. Chloe would nod. She didn't argue. There was nothing to argue. Understanding didn't require agreement. What Sebastian never fully understood was that Chloe was not trying to enter his family's world. She was observing it, learning its structure, its expectations, its limitations. And quietly, without announcing it to anyone, she was placing it into context. Back in the present, in the stillness of her apartment, Chloe reopened her laptop. Not the folder from earlier, a different one. Encrypted, layered, protected. Inside, the reality of her life existed in full. Accounts, holdings, trust structures that spanned continents. The name at the center of it all, Bennett Global Trust. Chloe looked at it for a moment. Not with pride, not with hesitation, just recognition. Then she closed the file. Because none of it needed to be used. Not yet. In the Whitmore household, exclusion was never loud. It did not arrive in the form of arguments or direct confrontation. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices echoing through hallways. That would have been too obvious, too crude. Instead, it was structured, measured, refined into something that could pass as etiquette. And Chloe Bennett, over time, came to understand that this form of exclusion was far more deliberate than anger ever could be. It began with invitations, or rather the absence of them. Family dinners would be mentioned in passing after they had already taken place. "Oh, it was last minute," Victoria would say, her tone light, almost apologetic. "We didn't think to disturb you." Chloe would nod. Of course they hadn't. There were charity galas where Sebastian was expected to attend. "You'll be busy with the kids," he would say, not unkindly. "It's not really your scene." Chloe would nod again. He was right. It wasn't her scene, but not for the reasons he believed. At larger gatherings, the pattern shifted. Chloe was present, but not included. Introductions were brief. This is Chloe. No context, no connection, no mention of her work, her background, or her role beyond the obvious. Conversations moved around her, not through her. Topics shifted subtly when she approached. Finance discussions paused. Business strategies softened into generalities. People smiled, politely, then redirected. Chloe noticed every instance, not emotionally, structurally. Victoria Whitmore orchestrated most of it, not overtly, never in a way that could be clearly identified as exclusion, but in positioning, in timing, in the careful management of who spoke to whom and when. Chloe prefers quieter conversations, Victoria once told a guest, gently guiding them away before Chloe could respond. It sounded considerate. It wasn't. It was control. Richard Whitmore, Sebastian's father, was different. He did not intervene. He did not participate actively in the subtle distancing. But he also did not disrupt it. His silence functioned as agreement, a quiet endorsement of the structure Victoria maintained. When he spoke to Chloe, it was polite, neutral. He asked about the children, never about her. Sebastian existed somewhere in between. At first, he tried to bridge the gap. Chloe works in finance, he would add occasionally, as if offering context that might correct the imbalance. But without specifics, the statement held little weight in the circles they occupied. Finance was broad, ambiguous. It did not signal status unless defined, and Chloe never defined it. Over time, Sebastian stopped trying. Not consciously, not with intention. But gradually, as repetition wore down effort, it became easier to let the structure remain, to move within it rather than question it. Chloe watched that shift carefully, not with resentment, but with clarity, because what changed was not just Sebastian's behavior. It was his alignment. He began to anticipate his family's expectations, to adjust before conflict could arise, to choose silence, not because he agreed, but because disagreement required energy he no longer wished to spend. The first time Chloe noticed it clearly was during a dinner at the Whitmore house. A smaller gathering, 8 people, controlled, predictable. Victoria had arranged seating deliberately. Chloe was placed at the far end of the table between a distant cousin and a guest who spent most of the evening checking his phone. Sebastian sat closer to the center, within conversation, within relevance. Halfway through the meal, the topic shifted to investments, a recent acquisition, a discussion layered with subtle competitiveness masked as analysis. Chloe listened. The details were incomplete, the assumptions slightly flawed. Not disastrously so, but enough that she recognized the direction of the conversation was built on partial understanding. She didn't interrupt. She rarely did. But when a pause opened naturally, she spoke. "Have you considered the currency exposure on that structure?" she asked, her tone even. The table stilled. Not dramatically, just enough. Victoria looked at her. Not surprised, not impressed. Simply evaluating. "We've managed similar exposures before," Victoria replied. The response was smooth, deflective. It closed the conversation without engaging it. No one followed up. The discussion moved on. Chloe did not speak again. Later in the car, Sebastian addressed it. "You don't have to challenge them like that," he said, his voice calm, but edged with something else. Chloe turned slightly toward him. "I asked a question. It sounded like more than that." A pause. "Then they don't know your background. It puts them in an awkward position." Chloe considered that. Not the words, the implication. "That I shouldn't speak unless I can justify it?" she asked. Sebastian exhaled. "That's not what I'm saying." But it was. After that, Chloe spoke less. Not because she agreed. Because she adjusted. Observation provided more information than participation ever could. At home, her habits deepened. Documentation became more precise. Not just what was said, but when, where, who was present. Patterns began to form more clearly. Not isolated incidents, but a system. A structure of behavior that, when viewed over time, revealed intent. Emails from Victoria became more frequent, polite, controlled, always framed as concern. We worry that you might feel disconnected. Perhaps it would help if you engage more with the family. Sebastian carries a great deal of responsibility. Support is important. Each message read as guidance. None acknowledged the environment that made engagement impossible. Chloe saved every one. Categorized, time-stamped. There were messages from Sebastian, too. Shorter, less formal. Mom thinks you should come to the fundraiser next week. It would mean a lot if you tried. Chloe attended. She stood where she was placed. She listened. She left when appropriate. Nothing changed. What the Whitmore family failed to understand was that Chloe was not confused by their behavior. She was mapping it, understanding its boundaries, its predictability. Because once something could be predicted, it could be prepared for. One evening, weeks before New Year's, Chloe sat at her desk reviewing her notes. Not emotionally, analytically. There was a consistency to the pattern now. A gradual escalation, from exclusion to questioning to positioning. She opened a new document, not part of her usual archive. Something separate, structured differently, not just observation, preparation. She titled it simply Contingency. Then she began outlining possibilities, not outcomes, scenarios. If this continues, if escalation occurs, if removal becomes explicit. Each line was clear, defined, without speculation. Across the apartment, Ethan and Ella played quietly. Their laughter, soft and intermittent, moved through the space without disrupting Chloe's focus. She paused for a moment, listened, then returned to the screen. Because whatever was forming it would not involve them. Not directly. She would ensure that. Chloe Bennett did not misunderstand the Whitmore family. She understood them precisely. And in that understanding, there was no anger, no urgency, only recognition. They were building towards something, slowly, deliberately. And when it arrived, they would believe it was justified, reasonable, even necessary. Chloe closed her laptop, not because she was finished, but because she had seen enough. For now, the shift did not happen suddenly, and that was precisely why it was effective. By the time the Whitmore family began to question Chloe Bennett openly, the foundation for that doubt had already been carefully constructed. It had been layered over months, even years, through small omissions, controlled conversations, and subtle reframing of her presence within the family. What had once been quiet exclusion was now becoming something more formal, something that carried the appearance of concern while moving steadily toward control. Victoria Whitmore was the one who gave it shape. She did not accuse Chloe directly. That would have required evidence she did not have. Instead, she asked questions in rooms where those questions would echo. During a luncheon attended by a small circle of long-standing acquaintances, Victoria mentioned almost casually that Chloe's work was difficult to define. The statement was delivered with a soft smile, the kind that suggested thoughtfulness rather than criticism. "I've always admired transparency," Victoria added, lifting her glass slightly as if the comment were philosophical rather than personal. No one challenged her. No one needed to. The idea had been placed. From that moment forward, Chloe's absence from visible financial or social structures was no longer interpreted as discretion. It became ambiguity. And in a world that relied on clarity of status, ambiguity was treated as weakness. Sebastian heard about it later, not from his mother, but from a colleague who repeated the comment in passing, framed as mild curiosity. "She keeps things private, doesn't she?" the colleague had said. "Your wife." Sebastian had smiled, dismissing it lightly at the time. But the question lingered longer than he admitted, settling somewhere beneath his usual confidence. That evening, he brought it home. They were in the kitchen. The children had already gone to bed, and the apartment was quiet in the way it always became after 8 o'clock. Chloe stood at the counter, organizing documents into neat, aligned stacks, her movements precise and unhurried. "People are starting to ask questions," Sebastian said. Chloe did not look up immediately. She finished aligning the edges of the papers before turning her attention to him. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "About what you do? About your income? It's becoming noticeable." His tone was measured, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort that he did not attempt to hide. Chloe considered his words carefully. "They've always had those questions," she replied. "They're just saying them out loud now." Sebastian exhaled, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture that had become more frequent in recent months. "That's exactly the point. It's becoming a problem." "For whom?" Chloe asked. The question was not confrontational. It was direct, and that made it harder to answer. Sebastian hesitated. "For everyone," he said finally, though even as he spoke, the answer lacked precision. Chloe did not challenge him. She had already understood what he meant. For his family, for their image, for the structure he had chosen to remain within. She nodded once, acknowledging the reality without agreeing to its premise. "I see," she said. That was all. The conversation ended, not because it had been resolved, but because Chloe did not extend it further. Sebastian watched her for a moment, as if expecting more. When none came, he turned away, carrying with him a frustration he could not fully articulate. What he did not realize was that Chloe had already begun to move beyond conversations. While the Whitmore family spoke in implications, Chloe worked in decisions. Within the same week, she initiated a series of actions that to an outside observer would have appeared routine. To those who understood legal and financial structures, they were anything but. She opened a separate legal account under her name alone, structured through a firm that did not advertise publicly and did not appear in the networks typically used by the Whitmore family. The process was quiet, efficient, and completed without the need for discussion. At the same time, she established a new line of communication with a legal entity in New York, one that specialized not in general family law, but in high-level asset protection and complex litigation. There were no dramatic meetings, no visible consultations. The correspondence was conducted through secure channels, documented carefully and stored within her existing system. Chloe did not rush any of it. Every step was deliberate, timed not by urgency, but by readiness. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family continued their progression. Victoria requested a private meeting with Sebastian, one that did not include Chloe. The conversation was framed as maternal concern, as guidance intended to protect the future of the family rather than to disrupt it. "She doesn't integrate." Victoria said, her tone calm but firm. "And that creates risk." Sebastian did not immediately respond. He listened as he always did, allowing the full structure of her argument to form before attempting to address it. "What kind of risk?" he asked. Victoria did not answer directly. "Uncertainty," she said. "And uncertainty in our position is something we cannot afford." She spoke about legacy, about continuity, about the importance of clarity in financial and social alignment. She did not accuse Chloe of wrongdoing. She did not need to. The implication was enough. By the end of the conversation, the suggestion had been introduced. A formal separation of financial structures. Not a divorce, not yet, but a precaution. Something reasonable, something responsible. Sebastian did not agree immediately, but he did not reject it either. And that was enough. When he brought the idea to Chloe, he presented it carefully, choosing his words with an awareness that had come too late to change their meaning. "It's just a formality," he said. "A way to make things clearer. For everyone." Chloe listened without interruption. "And if I decline?" she asked. Sebastian paused. "I think it would create more tension than necessary." Chloe held his gaze for a moment, not searching for emotion, but for alignment. She found none. Then she nodded. "All right," she said. The agreement came without resistance, no negotiation, no visible hesitation. Sebastian seemed relieved, interpreting her response as cooperation, as an indication that the situation was manageable. He did not ask why she agreed so easily. He did not consider that agreement in Chloe's world was not the same as acceptance. Within days, the documents were prepared. Andrew Collins, the Whitmore family attorney, oversaw the process. He was experienced, methodical, and accustomed to handling complex family structures. To him, this was routine, a protective measure, nothing more. Chloe reviewed the documents carefully, line by line, clause by clause. her expression did not change. When she signed, she did so with the same calm precision that defined every other action she took. But what Andrew Collins did not see, and what Sebastian did not ask, was that Chloe had already constructed a parallel structure, one that existed entirely outside their understanding, one that did not rely on their approval or their awareness. That same evening, after the documents had been finalized, Chloe returned home and updated her records. She added a new entry, clear, objective, time-stamped, noting the date, the agreement, the individuals involved. Then she opened the separate file she had created weeks earlier. Contingency, she added a single line. Financial separation initiated by opposing party. She paused briefly, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. Not because she was uncertain, but because she understood exactly what this meant. The progression had moved from implication to action, from structure to intent. And once intent became visible, outcome was no longer a question. It was only a matter of timing. Chloe saved the document and closed the laptop. Across the room, the quiet remained unchanged. The children were asleep, unaware of the shifts taking place around them. The city outside moved at its usual pace, indifferent to the subtle reconfiguration of a single family's future. Chloe sat still for a moment, her posture relaxed, her expression neutral. She did not feel anger. She did not feel urgency. She felt clarity. And clarity for Chloe Bennett was always the beginning of something irreversible. The email arrived at 10:17 p.m. It did not announce itself with urgency. There was no subject line that suggested importance, no formatting that separated it from the dozens of routine messages Chloe Bennett received each day. It appeared as a quiet addition to her inbox, indistinguishable at first glance from everything else. That was the only reason it was opened. Chloe had just finished reviewing a set of financial summaries when she noticed it. Her eyes moved across the sender's name before anything else. Andrew Collins, the Whitmore family attorney. That alone was unusual. Andrew had never contacted her directly without copying Sebastian or structuring the message formally. His communication style was consistent, controlled, and always intentional. This message did not follow that pattern. It had been forwarded, and it had been forwarded incorrectly. Chloe opened it without hesitation. The original email chain was still intact, preserved in full. Andrew Collins to Victoria Whitmore, time-stamped earlier that evening. Chloe read it once from beginning to end without interruption. Then she read it again, slower, more carefully. The language was professional, as expected, structured, precise. It carried no emotional tone, no suggestion of personal involvement. But within that structure, the intent was unmistakable. The subject was not protection, it was removal. Andrew outlined a series of strategic considerations in the event of marital dissolution. He referred to Chloe not as a person, but as a variable, a factor within a broader legal and financial equation. He detailed possible approaches to limit her access to shared assets, referencing the newly signed financial separation as a foundation for further action. He noted the importance of establishing narrative consistency, suggesting that concerns regarding Chloe's lack of financial transparency could be used to justify additional measures. There was a section on custody. Chloe read that part twice, not because she didn't understand it, but because she wanted to ensure she understood it exactly. The recommendation was cautious but clear. If necessary, it would be possible to argue that Chloe's financial ambiguity raised questions about stability. Not enough for immediate removal of custody, but sufficient to introduce doubt. Doubt in legal structures was often enough. Victoria's reply was shorter, less formal. She did not question the strategy. She approved it. There were no hesitations, only a single line that remained visible even after Chloe closed the message. We should proceed carefully but decisively. Chloe did not react immediately. She did not close the laptop. She did not move. For a moment, the apartment was completely still. Then quietly, she reached for her phone. Not to call anyone, to activate a secondary process. Within seconds, the email was duplicated, saved, archived in multiple locations, time-stamped, cross-referenced. She printed a physical copy. The printer hummed softly in the background, the only sound in the room. Chloe walked over and collected the pages as they emerged one by one. She did not skim them again. She already knew their contents. Instead, she placed them into a folder, labeled, dated, positioned alongside other documents that until now had remained incomplete. Now they formed something else. Not a pattern, a structure. Across the apartment, the clock moved forward. 10:42 p.m. Ethan and Ella were asleep, their breathing steady, their presence a quiet reminder of what remained constant. Chloe returned to her desk, opened a new document, not the archive, not the contingency file, something separate. She titled it Sequence. Then she began writing, not a narrative, not an emotional response, a timeline, precise, ordered, beginning with the earliest instance of exclusion she had documented. Moving through each escalation, each email, each conversation, each decision, until she reached the present. 10:17 p.m. Email received. She paused, then added a line beneath it. Intent confirmed. Sebastian arrived home just after 11. The sound of the door opening was soft, controlled, as if he was trying not to disturb anything. He placed his keys on the entry table, removed his coat, and stepped into the living room where Chloe was still seated. She had not moved. The laptop remained open in front of her, but the screen had dimmed. Its light reduced to a faint glow. Sebastian looked at her. Something in the room felt different. He couldn't immediately identify it. "Still up?" he asked, his tone casual, though it carried a hint of fatigue. Chloe turned her head slightly toward him. "Yes," she said. Nothing more. Sebastian hesitated, as if considering whether to continue the conversation. He chose not to. "I have an early morning tomorrow," he added, already moving toward the hallway. Chloe nodded. "I know," that was all. He disappeared into the bedroom, the door closing behind him, with a soft, final sound. Chloe remained where she was, unmoving. It would have been possible at that moment for her to confront him, to ask, to present the email, to demand an explanation. But Chloe Bennett did not operate within moments. She operated within outcomes. And outcomes required clarity, not reaction. Sebastian already knew about the email. That much was evident. He had been part of the structure that allowed it to exist. Whether he had written it, approved it, or simply allowed it to move forward without objection did not change its significance, he had not told her. That was enough. Chloe reached for her laptop again. The screen brightened. She opened the contingency file, scrolled to the most recent entry, then added another line. Legal strategy initiated by opposing party. Evidence secured. She paused briefly. Then beneath it, escalation threshold reached. The words were simple, but their meaning was not. They marked a transition, from observation to action, from preparation to execution. The next steps were already defined. They had been defined long before the email arrived. Chloe had not known when they would be necessary, only that they would be. Now the uncertainty was gone. She closed the laptop, not because she was finished, but because the next phase would not begin tonight. Timing mattered, precision mattered, and Chloe had never moved without both. Before turning off the light, she walked quietly down the hallway, paused at the children's room, opened the door just enough to see inside. Ethan was turned toward the wall, one arm tucked beneath his pillow. Ella lay on her back, her breathing slow and even. Chloe watched them for a moment. Not long, just enough. Then she closed the door. Back in the living room, she stood in the center of the space. Her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged. To anyone else, nothing would have seemed different. There were no visible signs, no raised voices, no disruption. But something had shifted. Permanently. Chloe Bennett did not need to guess what would come next. She had already seen it, mapped it, prepared for it. The email had not created the situation. It had clarified it, and clarity once established could not be undone. She turned off the light. The room fell into darkness. And in that darkness, without urgency, without hesitation, Chloe made a decision she would never reverse. The night of New Year's Eve did not unfold with chaos. It unfolded with precision, as if every moment had been quietly arranged long before Chloe Bennett ever stepped onto the driveway of the Whitmore estate. The house stood illuminated against the winter sky, its windows casting a warm golden light that suggested celebration, belonging, and continuity. Inside, laughter carried faintly through the glass, accompanied by the soft clink of crystal and the low murmur of conversations layered with familiarity. It was the kind of setting that signaled permanence, a place where traditions were not questioned but repeated year after year without interruption. Chloe approached with Ethan and Ella at her sides, her grip on their hands steady but not tight. Both children were dressed carefully, their coats buttoned, their small shoes polished in a way that reflected Chloe's attention to detail rather than any desire to impress. They had been told they were going to a family celebration, and they had accepted that explanation without hesitation. At 6 years old, they still believed that the word family carried a fixed meaning. As Chloe reached the entrance, the front door was already open, revealing a glimpse of the interior. Guests moved fluidly out through the foyer, their voices overlapping in a controlled harmony that belonged to people accustomed to being observed. A few heads turned toward the doorway, their expressions shifting briefly as they recognized Sebastian's wife, though no one stepped forward. It was Victoria Whitmore who moved first. She stepped into the threshold with the same composure she carried into every room. Her posture upright, her expression calm, her presence immediately establishing control over the space. She positioned herself in such a way that Chloe could not enter without passing directly through her. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence did not last long, but it was enough to draw attention. Chloe Victoria said, her voice even measured and clear enough to reach those nearest to the entrance. There was no greeting in it, no warmth, only acknowledgement. Chloe met her gaze without hesitation. Her expression remained neutral, her posture unchanged, her presence neither confrontational nor submissive. She simply stood where she was with Ethan and Ella beside her waiting. Victoria's eyes moved briefly to the children, then returned to Chloe. "This house is not for outsiders," she said. The words were delivered without emphasis, without visible emotion, but their placement within the room gave them weight. Conversations nearby slowed, then stopped entirely. The subtle shift in attention spread outward like a quiet ripple through the crowd. Chloe did not respond immediately. She did not ask for clarification. She did not question the statement, even though its meaning was unmistakable. Behind Victoria, the interior of the house remained unchanged. Guests stood with glasses in hand, their expressions carefully composed, their bodies angled in ways that suggested they were not directly observing, even as they were. Among them, Sebastian Whitmore stood near the center of the room. He had a clear view of the doorway. He saw everything, and he did not move. For a brief moment, his gaze met Chloe's. There was recognition in it, perhaps even hesitation, but it did not translate into action. He did not step forward. He did not speak. He remained where he was, allowing the distance between them to hold. Chloe noticed. She always noticed. Beside her, Ella shifted slightly, her small hand tightening around Chloe's fingers. "Mom," she whispered, her voice low enough that only Chloe could hear. Chloe lowered her gaze briefly, meeting her daughter's eyes. "It's all right," she said softly. The reassurance was simple, but it carried no false promise. Chloe did not explain what was happening. She did not soften it. She simply acknowledged the moment and contained it. Ethan remained silent, his attention fixed not on Victoria, but on Sebastian. There was a question in his expression, one he did not voice, but one that lingered in the space between them. Victoria waited. Not impatiently, but with certainty, as if the outcome of this interaction had already been decided. Chloe straightened slightly, her posture aligning with a quiet finality that was almost imperceptible, unless one was looking for it. "Understood," she said. Her voice was calm, controlled, and entirely without resistance. There was no argument, no attempt to negotiate, no effort to reclaim the space in front of her. The simplicity of her response created a different kind of silence, one that did not come from tension, but from the absence of expected reaction. For a moment, even Victoria seemed to pause, though her expression did not change. Chloe turned slightly, guiding Ethan and Ella away from the entrance. No one stopped her. No one spoke. The door remained open behind her for a fraction of a second longer, as if the moment had not fully settled, and then quietly it closed. Inside, the conversation resumed. Not immediately and not at its previous volume, but gradually, as though the interruption had been something minor, something that did not require acknowledgement. Sebastian did not follow. Outside, the cold air felt sharper than before, though Chloe's expression did not reflect it. She walked with the same steady pace. Her movements unchanged, her attention focused forward. Ethan and Ella followed without resistance, their earlier excitement replaced by a quiet confusion that neither of them attempted to articulate. The car was waiting where it had been left. The driver stepped forward, opening the door without asking questions, his demeanor professional, detached, and appropriately distant from whatever had just occurred. Chloe helped the children into the back seat, ensuring they were settled before she entered herself. The door closed with a muted sound, sealing them inside a space that felt removed from the house behind them. For several moments, no one spoke. The car began to move, pulling away from the curb with a smooth, controlled motion that matched the rhythm Chloe maintained in every aspect of her life. Ella leaned against her, her voice barely audible. "Why didn't they let us in?" Chloe placed her hand gently over her daughter's. "They made a decision," she said. "Did we do something wrong?" Ella asked. Chloe shook her head, her expression softening just slightly. "No," she said. "You didn't." Ethan remained quiet, but his gaze shifted toward the window, where the lights of the Whitmore estate receded into the distance. Chloe followed his line of sight for a brief moment, then returned her attention to the present. She did not look back again. What remained behind them was not just a house or a gathering or a moment of public humiliation that would be remembered in fragments by those who witnessed it. It was a boundary, clearly defined, irreversible. And Chloe understood that with absolute clarity. She had not been removed from the house in that moment. She had been formally separated from everything it represented. And that separation, once made visible, could not be undone through conversation, apology, or reconsideration. It existed now as fact. Inside the car, the quiet settled into something stable. Not comfortable, but controlled. Chloe rested her hand lightly over both of her children's, her presence steady, her breathing, even her posture unchanged. There were no visible signs of anger, no immediate response, no indication that anything had shifted beyond what had already been acknowledged. But beneath that stillness, something had aligned. The final piece of a structure that had been forming long before this night had taken its place. And with it, the path forward had become clear. Chloe Bennett did not need to decide what to do next. She had already prepared for it. The morning after New Year's Day did not feel different. That was the first thing Chloe Bennett noticed as she woke at exactly 6 o'clock. Her body following a rhythm that had never depended on circumstance. The apartment was quiet, the air still, the light outside pale and undecided. Nothing in the environment reflected what had happened less than 12 hours before. That too was familiar. Disruption rarely announced itself through external change. It existed beneath the surface in structures that only revealed their consequences over time. Chloe had learned to recognize that distinction early in life, and she did not mistake stillness for stability. By 6:15, she was seated at the kitchen counter, her laptop open. Her posture composed, her attention focused. The screen displayed a series of financial summaries, but she was not reading them in the same way she normally would. Her eyes moved across the numbers with precision, but her mind was elsewhere, organizing a different set of variables. At 7, she prepared breakfast. Ethan sat quietly as he always did, his movements careful, his attention observant. Ella spoke more than usual, her words circling around the same question without directly repeating it, as if she were trying to understand the previous night without forcing it into clarity. Chloe answered what needed to be answered. Nothing more. She did not explain the Whitmore family. She did not justify what had happened. She did not offer reassurances that would require future revision. She maintained consistency, and consistency for her children was enough. By 8, they were in the car. The drive to school followed the same route, the same turns, the same quiet intersections that had defined every weekday before this one. Chloe dropped them off at the entrance, watched until they disappeared inside, and then remained in the car for a moment longer. Not out of hesitation, out of alignment. She reviewed the sequence in her mind, not as a reaction to the previous night, but as a continuation of what had already begun. Then she reached for her phone. The contact she selected had not been used before. Daniel Harper. The call connected on the second ring. Daniel Harper? The voice on the other end said, professional, measured, and without unnecessary introduction. This is Chloe Bennett, she replied. There was a pause. Not long, but enough to indicate recognition. Yes, he said. I was expecting your call. Of course he was. Chloe did not ask how. She did not need to. I'd like to move forward, she said. There was no need to specify what forward meant. Daniel understood. Are you available this morning? He asked. Yes, I'll send you the address. The call ended without further discussion. The office of Harrington and Cole was located in New York, positioned within a building that did not rely on signage to establish its significance. Its reputation existed independently of visibility maintained through discretion and results rather than advertisement. Chloe arrived 10 minutes early. She always did. The reception area was quiet, designed to create distance rather than impression. There were no unnecessary displays, no attempt to project power through aesthetics. Everything was functional, controlled, intentional. Daniel Harper met her personally. He was younger than most attorneys who operated at his level, but there was nothing uncertain in his demeanor. His posture, his tone, the way he held eye contact without overextending it. All suggested a familiarity with high-stakes situations that did not require demonstration. Miss Bennett, he said. Mr. Harper. They did not exchange pleasantries beyond that. He led her into a private office, closed the door, and gestured toward a seat. Chloe sat. He remained standing for a moment, reviewing a file already open on his desk. I've gone through the materials you sent, he said, but I'd like to hear the sequence directly from you. Chloe nodded. She did not begin with emotion. She began with structure. She outlined the progression from the earliest documented instances of exclusion, moving through the financial separation agreement, and concluding with the email she had received the previous night. She did not speculate. She did not interpret. She presented facts, dates, actions, statements. Daniel listened without interruption. He did not take notes immediately. He observed. Only when Chloe finished did he sit down, opening the file in front of him more fully. The email, he said. Do you have a copy? Chloe reached into her bag and placed a folder on the desk. Printed and digital, she said. Daniel reviewed the printed pages, his expression unchanged as his eyes moved across the text. When he reached the section on custody, he paused slightly, then continued reading until the end. He closed the folder carefully. This is significant, he said. Chloe did not respond. She already knew. It establishes intent, Daniel continued. Not just precautionary planning, but a structured approach to limiting your position within both the marriage and the family. He leaned back slightly, considering the implications. Combined with the financial separation agreement, it suggests a coordinated effort. Chloe met his gaze. That is correct, she said. Daniel nodded. There are multiple directions we can take from here, he said. But before we proceed, I need to understand one thing clearly. He paused. Your financial position. Chloe did not answer immediately. Not because she was uncertain, because the answer required precision. I will provide full documentation, she said, but not within this room. Daniel watched her for a moment, then inclined his head slightly. Understood, he said. There was no challenge in his response, only adjustment. He had already suspected that Chloe's situation was not as simple as it appeared. The level of preparation, the structure of her documentation, the absence of emotional response on her all indicated a complexity that had not yet been disclosed. "Then we proceed with what we have," he said, "and integrate additional information as it becomes available." Chloe nodded. "That is acceptable." Daniel opened a new document on his computer. "First," he said, "we establish a formal legal position that includes filing for divorce, securing custody parameters, and initiating asset protection measures." He looked up briefly. "Given what you've presented, I recommend we move quickly." Chloe did not hesitate. "Proceed," she said. The process began immediately. Documents were drafted, timelines established, legal frameworks constructed with the same precision Chloe had applied to her own records. There was no urgency in the sense of panic, only momentum. Each step followed logically from the last, building a structure that did not rely on reaction, but on preparation. By early afternoon, the initial filings were ready. Daniel reviewed them once more before sliding them across the desk. "Take your time," he said. Chloe read every page, not quickly, not slowly, at exactly the pace required to ensure complete understanding. When she finished, she signed. Her signature was steady, controlled, and entirely without hesitation. Daniel collected the documents. "I'll have these filed immediately," he said. Chloe stood. "So will I," she replied. He paused. "Is there anything else you'd like to address today?" Chloe considered the question briefly. "Yes," she said. Daniel waited. Chloe met his gaze. "I want full custody." There was no emphasis in her voice, no visible emotion, just a statement of intent. Daniel nodded. "That aligns with our approach," he said. Chloe inclined her head slightly. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Outside, the city moved as it always did, unaffected by the decisions being made within its buildings. Chloe stepped into that movement without hesitation. There was no visible shift in her expression, no indication that anything irreversible had just begun. But it had. And unlike everything that came before, this phase would not remain hidden. Daniel Harper did not ask Chloe Bennett for immediate disclosure again. He understood enough to recognize that whatever she had chosen not to reveal in that first meeting was not a matter of hesitation, but of structure. Clients at Chloe's level did not withhold information out of uncertainty. They did so because timing control and jurisdiction mattered. Instead, he adjusted his approach. He began building the case outward from what was already confirmed, reinforcing the legal foundation with the documentation Chloe had provided, while leaving space for expansion. It was a strategy designed not just for strength, but for adaptability. Chloe, meanwhile, moved in parallel, not in response to Daniel's work, but alongside it. That evening, after returning from New York, Chloe followed the same routine she had always maintained. She picked up Ethan and Ella from school, listened as Ella spoke about a classroom activity that seemed trivial but mattered deeply to her, and observed Ethan's quieter mood without pressing him for explanation. At home, dinner was prepared with the same care as any other night. There was no indication from the outside that anything had shifted. But once the children were asleep, Chloe returned to her desk. This time, she did not open the contingency file. She opened the encrypted directory, the one that did not exist within any visible system, the one that had never been accessed in Sebastian's presence. The interface required multiple layers of authentication, not because the information was hidden out of fear, but because it had never been intended for casual access. Chloe entered the final passcode. The screen changed. A different structure appeared, not the organized records of daily observation, but something far more expansive, global, layered, interconnected. At the center of it, a single entity. Bennett Global Trust. Chloe did not pause when she opened it. She navigated through the system with familiarity, her movements precise, her attention focused. The data was extensive, spanning multiple jurisdictions, asset classes, and legal frameworks that operated across borders with seamless coordination. This was not a recent accumulation. It was a structure that had been built over time, carefully, deliberately, and largely invisible. The origins of the trust traced back to Martin Hale, not as its creator, but as its architect, within a broader network of private capital that existed outside conventional financial visibility. When Chloe had first been introduced to his organization, she had not been given ownership. She had been given access, responsibility. And over time, as her accuracy, discretion, and consistency proved beyond question, that access had evolved into something else. Equity, control, authority, not publicly, not in a way that could be traced through standard channels, but legally, structurally, undeniably. Chloe Bennett was the primary beneficiary, and not in name alone. The valuation updated in real time. Chloe glanced at it without reaction. Approximately $40 billion. The number itself held no emotional weight. It was not a measure of success. It was a variable, one that required management, not recognition. She opened a series of sub-accounts, offshore holdings, diversified portfolios, private equity positions embedded within larger corporate structures that did not list her name, but were tied to the trust through layered ownership. Each element reinforced the same reality. Her financial position was not just secure. It was insulated from scrutiny, from interference, from any external attempt to redefine it. Chloe selected a secure communication channel. The contact she chose had not been used in months. Martin Hale. The message she sent was brief, not explanatory, not emotional. Activation required. Legal proceedings initiated. Documentation to follow. The response came within minutes. Understood. No questions. No hesitation. That was the nature of the system. It did not require explanation. Only confirmation. Chloe closed the channel and began compiling the documents Daniel Harper would need. Not everything. Not immediately. But enough to establish a baseline that would fundamentally alter the structure of the case. She selected key records, verified their integrity, converted them into a format that maintained their legal admissibility across jurisdictions. Then she encrypted the package and prepared it for transfer. The next morning, Daniel received it. He did not open it immediately. He recognized the level of security applied to the file and understood that it was not routine. Instead, he cleared his schedule, closed his office door, and ensured that no part of the process would be interrupted. Only then did he begin. The first document established identity. Not Chloe Bennett as she appeared in public records, but Chloe Bennett as recognized within the trust. Primary beneficiary. Controlling authority. Daniel read the line twice. Not because he doubted it, because he understood what it meant. He continued. The financial records followed, layered, comprehensive, structured in a way that demonstrated not just ownership, but control. The valuation figures were consistent, approximately $40 billion. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. For a moment, the room was completely still, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he was recalibrating. Everything he had prepared so far had been based on a limited understanding of Chloe's position. That limitation no longer existed. He reached for his phone. "Miss Bennett," he said when the call connected, his tone as controlled as ever. "Yes," Chloe replied. "I've reviewed the documents," he said. A brief pause followed. Not uncertainty, adjustment. "We need to restructure the case." Chloe did not ask why. She already knew. "Proceed," she said. Daniel exhaled quietly, a subtle shift that reflected the magnitude of what had just changed. "With this information," he continued, "the narrative they've constructed becomes irrelevant. Their claims regarding your financial ambiguity no longer hold any weight. More importantly, their attempt to limit your position exposes them to significant legal risk." Chloe listened. Her expression remained unchanged. "We will not present everything at once," Daniel added. "We control the timing. We determine the sequence. That gives us leverage." Chloe nodded, though he could not see it. "That is acceptable," she said. Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of acknowledgement. "You've been preparing for this," he said. It was not a question. Chloe's response was simple. Yes. Across town, the Whitmore family was beginning to feel the first signs of pressure. Not from knowledge, but from absence. The legal notice had arrived. Formal, structured, unavoidable. Sebastian read it in his office, his expression tightening as he moved through the document. The language was precise, leaving little room for interpretation. Divorce proceedings, custody considerations, asset protection. He read it twice. Then he called Andrew Collins. "This escalated quickly," Sebastian said. Andrew's tone remained measured. "Given the email you were aware of, it's not unexpected." Sebastian closed his eyes briefly. She wasn't supposed to see that. Andrew did not respond to that, because the statement itself was irrelevant. What mattered was that she had. Victoria's reaction was more controlled. She read the notice in silence, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. "This is premature," she said finally. "Not necessarily," Andrew replied. "It suggests she's acting from a position of preparation." Victoria's gaze sharpened, slightly. Preparation based on what Andrew paused. That he said carefully is what we need to determine. What none of them understood yet was that the balance had already shifted. Not because Chloe had acted, but because she no longer needed to react. The structure she had built, the position she held, the clarity she maintained, all existed independently of their perception. And perception, in this case, was the only advantage they had ever possessed. Back in her apartment, Chloe closed her laptop. The documents had been sent. The sequence had been initiated. There was nothing more to prepare, only to execute. She walked to the window and looked out at the city, not searching, not reflecting, simply observing. Because everything that would follow had already been set into motion. And this time, it would not remain hidden. The legal notice did not create panic inside the Whitmore household, at least not on the surface. Panic in families like theirs was rarely expressed openly. It was contained, managed, and redirected into action. What it did create was disruption. And disruption, unlike emotion, could not be ignored. Sebastian Whitmore read the documents again later that evening, this time more slowly, seated at his desk with the door closed. The language was familiar to him. He had built arguments like this for clients, had seen similar filings used as leverage, as positioning, as signals of intent. But reading them as the subject, rather than the architect, introduced a different weight. The structure was precise. There was no excess language, no unnecessary claims, no emotional framing. Each section aligned with the next in a way that suggested not only preparation, but confidence. Whoever had drafted this was not testing a possibility. They were executing a plan. Sebastian recognized the name at the bottom of the filing. Daniel Harper. The recognition alone was enough to alter the way he interpreted everything else. Harper did not take cases without substance. His involvement indicated that Chloe had not acted impulsively. She had chosen her position carefully. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his hand resting against his temple as he considered the implications. His first instinct was to call Chloe to ask for clarification, to reframe the situation before it moved further beyond his control. But even as the thought formed, he understood that the time for that kind of conversation had already passed. Instead, he called Andrew Collins. Andrew arrived the next morning. The meeting took place in the Whitmore residence in a private sitting room that had hosted years of discussions framed as strategy rather than conflict. Victoria was already present, seated with her posture perfectly aligned. Her expression composed, her attention fixed on the documents in front of her. Richard Whitmore stood near the window, his presence quiet but deliberate, as though observing the situation from a distance that allowed him to remain uninvolved while still being present. Andrew entered without unnecessary formality, placing his briefcase on the table before taking a seat. "We need to reassess immediately," he said. Victoria looked up. Based on what she asked, her tone calm but sharpened by focus. Andrew opened the file, turning it so that both she and Sebastian could see. Based on the structure of this filing, he replied, "This is not reactive. It's coordinated." Sebastian nodded slightly. "I thought the same," he said. Victoria's gaze moved between them, coordinated with what she pressed. Andrew paused, choosing his words carefully. "That's the question we don't yet have an answer to." The room fell into a brief silence, not from uncertainty, but from the recognition that the situation extended beyond their current understanding. Victoria leaned back slightly, her fingers resting lightly against the arm of her chair. "She has no visible financial base," she said. "Her position relies on ambiguity, and ambiguity does not hold under scrutiny." Andrew did not immediately respond. Instead, he folded his hands on the table. "That assumption may no longer be safe," he said. Victoria's expression did not change, but something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Explain," she said. Andrew glanced briefly at Sebastian before continuing. "The speed and precision of this filing suggest access to resources that are not reflected in her public profile. That doesn't confirm anything, but it does indicate that we may be operating with incomplete information." Sebastian exhaled quietly. "You think she's hiding something?" he said. Andrew met his gaze. "I think we should consider that possibility." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. "Then we find out," she said. The statement was simple, but it carried immediate direction. Within hours, a private investigator was engaged. The instructions were clear: background verification, financial tracing, professional history, every available record that could provide clarity on Chloe Bennett's actual position. The investigator began with standard databases, moving through public records, employment histories, tax filings, and corporate affiliations. The process was methodical, thorough, and consistent with the level of detail required in cases involving high-value disputes. The results, however, did not align with expectations. There were records, but they were limited. Chloe's professional profile remained exactly as she had presented it. Independent financial consultant. No corporate affiliations of significance. No visible holdings. No indicators of substantial independent wealth. The absence of information in itself became notable. The investigator expanded the search. International databases, offshore registries, indirect ownership structures. Each layer required more time, more access, more effort. And still nothing conclusive emerged. It was not that Chloe Bennett had no financial presence. It was that whatever presence existed had been structured in a way that resisted visibility. When Andrew received the preliminary report, he read it twice before presenting it to the Whitmore family. "This is incomplete," Victoria said after reviewing the summary. Andrew nodded. "Yes," he replied, "but not in the way you think." He paused, allowing the distinction to settle. "This isn't a lack of data," he continued. "It's a lack of accessible data. That's a different problem." Sebastian leaned forward slightly. "What does that mean for us?" he asked. Andrew's response was measured. "It means we should not rely on assumptions about her financial position. Not until we have confirmation." Victoria remained silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the document. Then she looked up. "Then we proceed with what we know," she said. Andrew inclined his head slightly. "That would be advisable," he replied. But even as the conversation moved forward, the underlying uncertainty remained. Not visible, not acknowledged directly, but present. Across the city, Chloe Bennett continued her routine without deviation. She woke at the same time, prepared breakfast, drove Ethan and Ella to school. Her movements were unchanged, her expression consistent, her attention focused on the immediate tasks in front of her. There was no outward indication that the legal process had begun to shift around her. But internally, the structure was advancing. Daniel Harper had already begun to adjust the case strategy. The introduction of Chloe's financial position would not occur immediately. It would be timed positioned to maximize its impact while minimizing the opportunity for counteraction. For now, the focus remained on behavior, on documentation, on establishing a clear pattern of exclusion and intent that would stand independently of financial disclosure. Chloe reviewed the updated strategy that evening, her eyes moving across the details with the same precision she applied to every aspect of her life. She did not question the approach. It aligned with her own. Control the sequence, control the outcome. She closed the document and set her laptop aside. Across the room, Ethan sat quietly reading, his posture relaxed but attentive. Ella was drawing at the table, her focus shifting between colors and shapes that existed entirely within her own understanding. Chloe watched them for a moment, not with concern but with clarity. Everything that followed would center on them, not as a reaction, but as a priority. Back at the Whitmore residence, the uncertainty continued to expand. Not dramatically, not in a way that disrupted daily routines, but in small, accumulating ways. Questions that did not have answers, gaps that could not be filled. A growing awareness that the situation they believed they understood might in fact extend beyond their control. And within that awareness, a quiet tension began to form, one that would not resolve itself. Because for the first time, they were not defining the structure. They were responding to one they could not yet see. The discovery phase did not begin with confrontation. It began with documentation. That was the nature of legal process at this level. There were no dramatic entrances, no sudden declarations that shifted everything in a single moment. Instead, there was structure. Requests were filed, responses were prepared, and information moved between parties in controlled, deliberate exchanges that carried more weight than any argument spoken aloud. Daniel Harper approached discovery with precision. He did not attempt to overwhelm the opposing side immediately. Instead, he constructed a sequence that revealed just enough to establish direction while reserving the most consequential elements for later. It was a strategy designed not only to build a case, but to control its perception. The first set of documents focused on communication. Emails, messages, recorded timelines that Chloe Bennett had maintained with consistent accuracy. They were submitted without commentary, without interpretation, and without any attempt to frame them emotionally. Each document existed on its own, presented as fact rather than accusation. Andrew Collins received them early in the morning. He reviewed them in his office alone, his attention moving steadily across each page. At first glance, none of the individual pieces appeared extraordinary. The emails were polite, the language measured. There were no explicit statements of hostility, no direct threats, no clear violations that could be isolated and challenged easily. But as he continued, the pattern began to emerge. Not in what was said, but in what was consistently implied. Chloe's exclusion from family decisions, her absence from key events, the repetition of language that positioned her as external to the Whitmore structure. Each instance on its own could be dismissed. Together, they formed something else. A narrative. One that had been constructed over time, not through overt action, but through consistent positioning. Andrew leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression remaining controlled, but his focus sharpening. He understood what Daniel Harper was doing. This was not an argument. It was a foundation. Later that day, Andrew met with Sebastian and Victoria. The documents were laid out on the table, organized, indexed, and presented with the same clarity Chloe had applied when she first recorded them. Victoria reviewed them carefully, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. "These are interpretations," she said. Andrew shook his head slightly. "They are records," he replied. "The interpretation comes later." Sebastian remained silent for a moment, his gaze moving across a printed email that he recognized immediately. It was one he had sent. Brief, neutral. At least that was how he had understood it when he wrote it. Now, placed within a broader sequence, it read differently. Not hostile, but distant, positioned. He looked up. "They're taking this out of context," he said. Andrew met his gaze. "They're providing context," he replied. The distinction settled into the room with quiet weight. Victoria closed the folder in front of her, her movements controlled. "This is not sufficient to establish anything substantial," she said. Andrew did not disagree. "Not on its own," he said, "but it's not intended to stand on its own." He opened another file. "This is the next layer." The second set of materials included audio recordings. Not illegal, not covert in a way that violated admissibility. They had been obtained in settings where recording was permitted, where conversations had occurred without expectation of privacy. Victoria's voice filled the room as Andrew pressed play. Clear, composed, unmistakably hers. "She doesn't understand how this family operates," the recording said. "And at some point, that becomes a liability." The audio continued capturing fragments of conversations that, in isolation, might have been dismissed as opinion. But placed within sequence aligned with the emails and documented events, they reinforced the same structure. Exclusion, positioning, preparation. Victoria listened without interruption. When the recording ended, she reached forward and turned off the device herself. "These are selective," she said. Andrew nodded. "All evidence is," he replied. "The question is whether it's consistent." Sebastian shifted slightly in his seat, his attention fixed on the table rather than on either of them. He had heard his mother speak like that before. Not as accusation, as assessment. It had always seemed normal, appropriate even. Now within this framework, it sounded different. Not because the words had changed, but because their placement had. Chloe Bennett did not attend any of these meetings. She did not need to. Everything she had intended to communicate was already present within the documentation. Her role was not to argue. It was to ensure that the structure remained intact. That same afternoon, Daniel Harper updated her. "They've received the first and second submissions," he said. Chloe listened. "Response?" she asked. "Controlled," Daniel replied. "They're minimizing reframing, attempting to reduce the pattern to isolated incidents." Chloe nodded slightly. "As expected," she said. Daniel allowed a brief pause. "The next phase will increase pressure," he added. "We introduce elements that limit their ability to reposition the narrative." Chloe's expression did not change. "Proceed," she said. The next submission included internal correspondence. Not from Chloe, from Andrew Collins. The same email Chloe had received weeks earlier. Presented now within the formal structure of discovery, authenticated, verified, and positioned as evidence of intent. Andrew saw it the moment it arrived. For the first time, his composure shifted. Not visibly. Not in a way that would be recognized by someone unfamiliar with him. But enough. He read the email in silence, his eyes moving across words he had written, now reframed within a context he no longer controlled. There was no ambiguity, no reinterpretation. The language spoke for itself. Victoria read it next. Her expression remained composed, but her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the paper. Sebastian did not reach for it immediately. He already knew its contents. When he finally looked, he did not read it line by line. He scanned it, enough to confirm what he had already understood. That it existed, that it was now visible, that it could not be removed. "This changes the position," Andrew said finally. Victoria looked at him. How, she asked. Andrew chose his words carefully. "It establishes intent beyond precaution," he said. "It suggests coordination, strategy, and awareness." Victoria's gaze sharpened. "It was a discussion," she said, "not an action." Andrew did not challenge her directly. In legal terms, he replied, discussion can be sufficient if it demonstrates planning. The room fell silent again. Not from confusion, from recognition. The structure they had built, the one they believed was contained within private conversation and internal planning, had been exposed. Not publicly, not yet, but within a system that would treat it as fact. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his expression distant. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the situation without framing it as manageable. He saw the sequence more clearly now, not just the legal filings, but everything that had led to them. Chloe's silence, her consistency, the absence of reaction where reaction would have been expected. He had interpreted it as disengagement. Now it appeared as something else. Preparation. He exhaled slowly. "We underestimated her," he said. No one disagreed. Across the city, Chloe closed her laptop. The phase had progressed exactly as expected. The documents had been received. The pattern had been established. The intent had been exposed. There was nothing left to clarify, only to conclude. She stood, walked into the living room, and sat beside Ethan and Ella. Ella leaned against her immediately, her presence warm, uncomplicated. Ethan remained quiet, but his posture relaxed slightly. Chloe placed a hand over each of theirs, not as reassurance, as consistency, because everything that mattered reigned unchanged, even as everything else moved toward its final resolution. The courtroom did not carry the tension most people imagined when they thought about legal conflict. There were no raised voices, no sudden confrontations, no visible hostility that could be easily identified and interpreted. Instead, there was structure. Everything followed a sequence that had been defined long before either party entered the room, and that sequence left very little space for emotion. Chloe Bennett arrived early as she always did. She wore a dark, understated suit, nothing designed to attract attention, nothing intended to communicate status. Her presence was composed, her posture aligned, her expression neutral. To an outside observer, she appeared calm. To those who understood her, she was simply consistent. Daniel Harper stood beside her, reviewing a set of documents one final time. His tone remained low, controlled, and precise as he outlined the order in which the arguments would be presented. "We proceed with behavior first," he said. "Then intent. We introduce financial structure only when necessary." Chloe listened without interruption. She did not ask questions. She did not offer adjustments. Everything had already been discussed. Everything had already been decided. Across the room, Sebastian Whitmore entered with Andrew Collins and Victoria Whitmore. Their movements were measured, their expressions composed, their posture reflective of a family accustomed to operating within controlled environments. For a brief moment, Sebastian's gaze met Chloe's. There was no attempt at communication, no acknowledgement beyond recognition. They held each other's gaze for a second longer than necessary, and then both looked away. That was enough. The proceedings began without ceremony. The judge entered the room, and then settled again into stillness. There were no introductions beyond what was required. No statements beyond what had been prepared. Daniel Harper stood first. His presentation did not begin with accusation. It began with sequence. He outlined the timeline of events with clarity, referencing specific dates, communications, and documented interactions that had been submitted during discovery. His voice remained steady. His pace controlled, his language precise. He did not raise his tone. He did not attempt to persuade through emphasis. He allowed the structure to speak. The emails were introduced, displayed, read in segments that highlighted their consistency rather than their content in isolation. Each message reinforced the same pattern, positioning Chloe as external, excluding her from decisions, framing her presence as temporary. Daniel did not interpret these messages. He did not describe them as harmful. He simply presented them in sequence. The effect was cumulative. The audio recordings followed. Victoria's voice, clear and unmistakable, filled the courtroom in controlled segments. Each recording was short-selected, not for dramatic effect, but for consistency of tone and intent. She doesn't understand how this family operates. At some point, that becomes a liability. The statements were not aggressive. They were measured. But within the context of the case, they established a perspective that aligned with the documented behavior. Andrew Collins objected at appropriate intervals. His argument structured his tone. Respectful, his approach consistent with the role he played. He did not attempt to deny the existence of the recordings. Instead, he challenged their interpretation, emphasizing their selective nature and the absence of full context. The judge acknowledged the objections, but allowed the evidence. Chloe remained seated throughout. Her hands rested lightly on the table in front of her, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. She did not react to the recordings, even when her own name was spoken within them. She did not shift, did not look toward Victoria, did not acknowledge Sebastian. She did not need to. Everything that mattered was already in motion. When it was Andrew's turn to present, he did so with the same level of control. He focused on stability, on continuity, on the absence of overt conflict within the marriage. He emphasized Chloe's lack of visible financial structure, positioning it as uncertainty rather than deficiency, and argued that the Whitmore family's actions had been guided by concern rather than exclusion. His arguments were structured, logical, consistent with the information available to him. But they lacked one element, completion, because the information he was working from was no longer complete. Daniel Harper stood again. This time he did not begin immediately. He allowed a brief pause, just long enough for the room to settle for the previous arguments to reach their natural conclusion. Then he spoke. "There is one element that has not yet been addressed," he said. His tone remained unchanged, but the shift in direction was clear. He turned slightly, indicating a set of documents that had not yet been introduced. "With the court's permission, we would like to submit additional financial documentation relevant to the case." Andrew's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly. He understood what this meant. He did not yet know the content, but he recognized the timing. The judge granted permission. Daniel stepped forward. The documents were distributed, structured, verified, prepared with the same precision that had defined every previous element of the case. Chloe did not move. She did not watch as the documents were handed out. She did not need to see them again. She already knew what they contained. Andrew received the file first. He opened it. His eyes moved across the first page, then stopped. Not dramatically, but completely. He read the line again. Primary beneficiary. Controlling authority. Bennett Global Trust. The valuation followed. He did not react outwardly, but the shift was immediate. His understanding of the case recalibrated in real time. He turned the page, continued reading. Each document reinforced the same conclusion. The financial structure Chloe had been described as lacking did not just exist. It existed at a level that redefined the entire case. Victoria read next. Her composure held, but only at the surface. Her gaze sharpened, her posture tightening slightly as she moved through the documents. For the first time, there was no immediate interpretation, no reframing, only recognition. Sebastian did not read immediately. He looked at Chloe. She remained still, unchanged. Then he lowered his gaze to the documents. He read slowly, more slowly than Andrew, more slowly than Victoria. Because for him, the information did not just alter the case. It altered everything that had come before it. The assumptions, the judgments, the silence he had chosen. He finished reading, then closed the file. Carefully. Daniel Harper did not elaborate. He did not emphasize the numbers. He did not describe the scale. He simply stated what had already been established within the documentation. Miss Bennett's financial position is not ambiguous, he said. It is structured, verified, and entirely independent of the Whitmore family. He paused, allowing the statement to settle. The actions taken against her were not based on uncertainty, he continued. They were based on assumption. The room remained quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been presented. Chloe sat without movement, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. There was no indication of satisfaction, no visible reaction to the shift in balance. Because for her, the balance had never been in question, only the moment of its visibility. And now, that moment had arrived, irreversibly. The shift in the courtroom did not come with noise. It came with stillness. Not the kind of silence that follows confusion, but the kind that settles when understanding arrives all at once, leaving no immediate response available. The documents lay open on the tables in front of each party, their contents no longer theoretical, no longer implied, but established with a clarity that could not be reduced or reframed. Daniel Harper did not speak again immediately. He did not need to reinforce what had already been presented. The structure of the case had changed not because of argument, but because of reality. The financial position Chloe Bennett had maintained quietly without visibility now existed within the legal record with full recognition. The judge reviewed the documents with careful attention, moving through each section methodically. There was no visible reaction, no indication of surprise, but the time taken to examine the material reflected its weight. Across the room, Andrew Collins adjusted his approach in real time. He leaned slightly toward Sebastian, his voice low, controlled, and precise. "We need to pivot," he said. Sebastian did not respond immediately. His attention remained on the documents in front of him, though he was no longer reading them. He had already understood what they meant not only for the case, but for everything that had led to it. "We can't challenge the authenticity," Andrew continued quietly. "The documentation is too complete." Sebastian nodded once, though his expression remained distant. "What does that leave us?" he asked. Andrew paused, choosing his words carefully. "Mitigation," he said. "We reduce exposure. We shift focus to resolution." Victoria Whitmore, seated beside them, did not join the conversation immediately. She was still looking at the documents, not scanning them, not searching for error, simply looking. For years, she had operated within a framework where information was controlled, where influence could be exercised through positioning, through perception, through the quiet management of what others saw and what they did not. This was different. This was information that existed outside her control. Not hidden, not negotiable, simply present. She closed the file, slowly, her movements precise. Her expression composed, but her posture no longer carried the same certainty it had before. "This does not change behavior," she said. Her voice was steady, but quieter. Andrew turned toward her. "It changes how behavior is interpreted," he replied. Victoria held his gaze. "For the court," she said. Andrew did not argue. "That's the only place that matters now," he said. Chloe Bennett remained still. She had not shifted her position. She had not looked toward the opposing table. She had not acknowledged the reaction her financial disclosure had created. Because for her, this was not a moment of revelation. It was a step within a sequence that had been defined long before. The documents had not changed her position. They had only made it visible. The proceedings continued, not with escalation, but with adjustment. Andrew Collins stood again, his tone measured, his approach recalibrated. He did not attempt to dispute Chloe's financial standing. He did not question the validity of the trust or the extent of her holdings. Instead, he shifted the focus. He emphasized stability, continuity, the absence of overt conflict within the marriage prior to the recent escalation. He framed the Whitmore family's actions as precautionary rather than exclusionary, suggesting that their concerns had been based on incomplete information rather than intent. It was a controlled argument, carefully structured, but its foundation had shifted. Because the assumption of Chloe's ambiguity, which had supported every previous claim, no longer existed. Daniel Harper responded with the same precision he had maintained throughout. He did not challenge Andrew's tone. He did not dismiss the argument. He simply returned to the established sequence. Intent, he said, is not determined by outcome, but by action. He referenced the email, the documented conversations. The pattern of exclusion that had been established before any financial disclosure had been made. These actions were not taken in response to Ms. Bennett's financial position, he continued. They were taken in its absence based on assumptions that have now been proven incorrect. He paused. Not for effect, for clarity. The existence of those assumptions, he added, does not mitigate the actions taken. The judge listened without interruption. The structure of the case was now fully visible, not as competing narratives, but as aligned sequences of action and consequence. Sebastian Whitmore sat without speaking. For most of the proceedings, he had remained composed. His posture aligned, his expression controlled. But as the case progressed, that control became something else. Not lost, but strained. He looked at Chloe again. Not briefly this time, longer, as if trying to reconcile the person he had lived beside with the reality that had been presented in front of him. Chloe did not return the look, not out of avoidance, out of completion. There was nothing left to exchange. For the first time, Sebastian allowed himself to consider the full sequence without interruption. The early years, the consistency of Chloe's behavior, the absence of conflict where conflict might have clarified things sooner. He had interpreted her silence as distance, as disengagement, as a lack of involvement. Now it appeared as something else. Not absence, control, not disengagement, observation. And within that observation, a level of understanding he had never fully recognized. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering, not in defeat, in acknowledgement. Victoria remained composed. But the certainty that had once defined her presence was no longer intact. She had built her position on clarity, on the ability to define roles, to structure relationships, to determine who belonged and who did not. That structure had failed, not because it had been challenged directly, but because it had been incomplete. And incompleteness, once exposed, could not be corrected through assertion. The courtroom moved toward conclusion, not dramatically, not with a decisive moment that separated before and after, but through a gradual alignment of information that left little room for reinterpretation. The arguments had been presented, the evidence established, the structure clear. Chloe Bennett sat as she had from the beginning, unmoved, unchanged. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no visible reaction to the shift that had taken place, because for her the outcome had never been about reversal. It had never been about proving anything to the Whitmore family. It had been about clarity, and clarity had been achieved. As the session adjourned, the room began to shift. Papers were gathered. Conversations resumed in low, controlled tones. Movement returned, but without urgency. Daniel Harper turned to Chloe. "We're in a strong position," he said. Chloe nodded. "I know," she replied. There was no emphasis in her voice, no need for reassurance, because strength for Chloe Bennett had never depended on recognition. It had always existed independently of it. Across the room, Sebastian remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. Victoria stood beside him, her posture returning to its usual alignment, though the subtle tension remained. Andrew gathered his files, already considering the next steps, the adjustments that would need to be made. But none of them spoke to Chloe. Not because they chose not to. Because there was nothing left to say. Chloe stood. She did not look back. She did not pause. She walked toward the exit with the same measured pace she had maintained from the beginning. And this time, there was no door to block her path. The final decision was not delivered with drama. There were no prolonged speeches, no emotional declarations that framed the outcome as victory or defeat. The judge spoke in a measured tone, outlining conclusions that had already been shaped by the structure of the case, by the documentation, and by the consistency of the evidence presented over time. Chloe Bennett stood as the ruling was read. Her posture remained steady, her expression composed, her attention focused not on the individuals around her, but on the words themselves. Each sentence carried weight not because it introduced anything unexpected, but because it formalized what had already become clear. Full legal custody of Ethan and Ella was granted to Chloe. The decision was supported by the documented pattern of exclusion, the established intent within the Whitmore family's actions, and the stability Chloe had demonstrated consistently throughout the proceedings. There was no criticism directed outward, no condemnation expressed toward Sebastian or his family. The language remained neutral, precise, and grounded entirely in fact. The court recognized Chloe's financial independence as an additional factor not in terms of wealth, but in terms of her ability to provide a stable, controlled environment without reliance on external structures that had proven inconsistent. All claims regarding shared financial control were dismissed. The assets associated with the Bennett Global Trust were confirmed as entirely separate, beyond the reach of marital division, protected by the legal frameworks already in place long before the marriage had been questioned. The financial separation agreement, originally introduced by the Whitmore family as a protective measure, was acknowledged as reinforcing Chloe's independent position rather than limiting it. No penalties were assigned, no damages awarded. The ruling did not seek to rebalance through punishment. It sought only to define, and in defining it, close the structure completely. Sebastian Whitmore listened without interruption. He did not react outwardly, did not shift in his position, did not attempt to respond before the ruling was fully delivered. His training as an attorney had taught him how to maintain composure in situations that demanded control, and he applied that discipline now. But beneath that composure, something had settled into place. Not shock, not resistance, recognition. The outcome aligned with what he had already begun to understand during the proceedings. The evidence had not left room for reinterpretation, and the clarity Chloe had maintained throughout had made it impossible to construct an alternative narrative that would hold. When the judge finished speaking, Sebastian nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging not the authority of the court, but the inevitability of the result. He did not look toward Chloe, not immediately, because the distance between them was no longer defined by disagreement. It was defined by finality. Victoria Whitmore remained composed. Her posture did not change her expression, did not reveal anything that could be easily interpreted as reaction. Years of control of maintaining presence under scrutiny held firm even now. But the structure she had relied on, the one that had allowed her to define boundaries and determine positions, no longer existed in the same form. It had not been taken from her. It had simply proven insufficient. She closed the folder in front of her with deliberate care, aligning the edges before placing it on the table. There was no attempt to speak, no effort to reframe what had been decided, because there was nothing left to adjust. Andrew Collins gathered his materials in silence. His role from this point forward was procedural. The strategy phase had concluded, and what remained was execution of the court's ruling, ensuring that every detail was implemented according to the legal framework established. He glanced briefly toward Chloe, not with surprise, but with a professional acknowledgement of what had been achieved. The case had not been won through argument. It had been secured through structure. Daniel Harper turned to Chloe once the session concluded. "We'll finalize the remaining documentation within the week," he said. "There are a few administrative steps, but nothing that alters the outcome." Chloe nodded. "Understood." Daniel paused briefly. "If you need anything further, you can contact me directly." "I will." There was no extended conversation, no expression of relief, because relief implied uncertainty, and Chloe had not operated within uncertainty. As the courtroom began to empty, movement returned in quiet, controlled patterns. Conversations resumed in low tones, papers were collected, and individuals moved toward their next obligations as if the conclusion of this case were simply one part of a larger sequence. Chloe gathered her things with the same precision she applied to everything else. She stood, turned, and began to walk toward the exit. This time there was no obstruction, no voice calling her back, no presence attempting to redirect her path. Sebastian remained where he was for a moment longer. Then he stood. The movement was automatic, practiced aligned with years of habit. But when he looked up, Chloe was already near the door. He hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, because he understood that what could be said no longer carried weight. Still, he stepped forward. "Chloe." Her name spoken once without emphasis. Chloe stopped, not immediately, but after a step. She turned. Her expression remained neutral, composed. She did not approach him. She did not close the distance. She simply waited. Sebastian met her gaze. There were words available to him, explanations, acknowledgments, perhaps even apologies. But none of them aligned with the structure that now existed between them. "I didn't," he began, then stopped. The sentence did not complete itself. Chloe listened, Not with expectation, not with resistance, simply with attention. After a moment, Sebastian exhaled. "It's clear now," he said. The statement was not directed at her. It was an acknowledgement of his own understanding. Chloe nodded once. "Yes," she said. "Nothing more." There was no extension of the conversation, no attempt to revisit what had already been concluded. Because for Chloe, the purpose of clarity was not to create dialogue. It was to end it. She turned again, and this time she did not stop. Outside, the air carried a quiet stillness that contrasted with the controlled environment of the courtroom. The city moved as it always did, unaffected by individual outcomes, indifferent to personal conclusions. Chloe stepped into that movement without hesitation. Her pace remained steady, her posture aligned, her attention focused forward. There was no visible change, no outward sign that anything had been resolved. But internally, the structure had closed. Completely. Back inside, Sebastian watched her leave. He did not follow, not because he could not, but because he understood that following would not alter anything that had already been defined. Victoria stood beside him, her presence returning to its usual composure, though the subtle shift remained. "This is finished," she said. Sebastian did not respond immediately. He looked toward the door Chloe had passed through. Then quietly he nodded. "Yes," he said, and for the first time, the word did not carry expectation, only acceptance. Chloe Bennett did not look back. She had no reason to. Everything that had needed to be established had been established. Everything that had required clarity had been clarified. And everything that had once been uncertain now existed in a form that could not be undone. She stepped forward, not into something new, but into something that had been waiting fully formed long before this moment had arrived. The move to California was not announced. It was executed. Within 2 weeks of the court's final ruling, Chloe Bennett had already secured a residence along the coast near Monterey, a place chosen not for its status, but for its distance. The house itself did not reflect the scale of her financial position. It was not expansive, not designed to impress, not positioned to be seen. Instead, it faced the ocean, quietly set back, just enough to exist within its surroundings, rather than above them. Everything about the decision was consistent with Chloe's approach. Control did not require visibility. It required alignment. The transition was smooth. The children's school records were transferred without complication. New routines were established with the same precision Chloe had always maintained. There were no abrupt changes, no attempts to redefine their environment all at once. Each adjustment was introduced gradually, allowing Ethan and Ella to settle without disruption. Ethan noticed the difference first, not in the house, not in the structure of their days, but in the absence of tension. He did not articulate it, but Chloe observed it in the way he moved more freely through the space, in the way his attention no longer shifted toward doorways or conversations that might signal something uncertain. Ella adapted more quickly. She accepted the new environment with the same openness she had always shown, her focus moving easily from one detail to the next. The ocean became a point of fascination, its constant movement offering something she could watch without needing to understand. Chloe allowed both responses without guiding them. Adaptation, she understood, was not something that could be directed. It had to occur on its own. The house was furnished simply, functional, ordered. Each item placed with intention, not decoration. There were no unnecessary additions, no elements designed to reflect wealth or status. The space remained consistent with everything Chloe had maintained before, only now it existed without external interference. Mornings followed the same rhythm: 6 o'clock, kitchen, laptop. But the view had changed. Instead of city streets, there was the horizon, the line where the ocean met the sky, shifting in color with each passing hour. Chloe did not watch it for long. She acknowledged it, then returned to her work. The structure remained the same. Only the environment had shifted. Daniel Harper finalized the remaining legal documentation within the week, as promised. The case closed without complication, its outcome fully implemented, its terms clearly defined. There were no further communications from the Whitmore family. No attempts to reopen discussion. No requests for reconsideration. The separation remained complete. Chloe did not expect anything else. Occasionally, information reached her indirectly. Not through contact, through networks that operated quietly without drawing attention to themselves. Sebastian Whitmore had returned to work. His schedule remained consistent, his position unchanged. But his presence within certain social circles had shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed by those who observed patterns closely. Victoria Whitmore continued to host events to maintain the structure she had built over decades. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, there were adjustments. Subtle, controlled, necessary. Chloe did not follow these updates closely. She acknowledged them, then let them pass, because they no longer intersected with her life. One evening, several weeks after the move, Chloe sat at the dining table with Ethan and Ella. The meal was simple, not elaborate, prepared with the same care she had always given, but without any sense of occasion. The windows were open slightly, allowing the sound of the ocean to move through the room in a steady, uninterrupted rhythm. Ella spoke about school, her words moving quickly, her thoughts shifting between subjects without pause. Ethan listened, then added small observations of his own, his voice quieter but more certain than it had been before. Chloe listened to both of them, not directing the conversation, not shaping it, allowing it to exist. At one point, Ella looked up. "Are we staying here?" she asked. Chloe met her gaze. "Yes," she said. For a long time, Ella continued. Chloe paused briefly, then nodded. Yes, the answer was simple, but it carried certainty. Ella seemed satisfied with that. She returned to her food, her attention moving on without hesitation. Ethan did not ask anything, but his posture shifted slightly, his shoulders relaxing, in a way that did not go unnoticed. After dinner, the routine continued. Dishes, preparation for the next day, bedtime, consistency remained. Because consistency, more than anything else, created stability. Later that night, Chloe sat alone in the living room. The lights were low. The sound of the ocean remained constant. Her laptop rested closed on the table beside her. There was no immediate work to complete, no documents to review, no structures left to build. For the first time, in a long while, there was no sequence requiring her attention. Not because her life had become simpler, but because the complexity had already been resolved. Chloe did not reflect in the way most people expected. She did not revisit the past to reinterpret it. She did not analyze the decisions that had led to the present moment, because for her, those decisions had never been uncertain. They had been necessary, and necessity did not require reconsideration. The house remained quiet, the children asleep, the night moving forward without interruption. Chloe sat for a while. Longer, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged. There was no visible satisfaction, no sense of victory, because nothing had been won. Something had been clarified. Eventually she stood, turned off the light, and walked toward the hallway. Her steps remained measured, steady, unchanged. Because everything she had done, everything she had built, had always led here. Not to an ending, but to a state where nothing needed to be proven. Chloe Bennett did not carry the past with her. She carried its structure, and that structure no longer required defense. The story does not end with what was revealed in a courtroom or with the quiet departure from a house that once defined belonging. It continues in the spaces that follow, in the choices that are no longer shaped by exclusion, and in the presence of a life that does not require validation to exist with dignity. What Chloe Bennett understood long before anyone else did was that power is not something that needs to be displayed to be real. It does not rely on recognition, nor does it depend on the acknowledgement of those who fail to see it. It exists in preparation and restraint, and in the ability to act without noise when the moment arrives. Silence, in her case, was never weakness. It was timing. And timing, when aligned with clarity, becomes something that cannot be undone. There are moments in life when people reveal who they are not, through what they say, but through what they assume about others. And sometimes those assumptions build structures that feel unshakable, until they are placed against a truth that was never visible to begin with. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to reflect on where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. These stories travel far, but they always land somewhere real. And if you believe that dignity, restraint, and quiet strength still matter, you already understand why stories like this are worth telling. You can stay for more, only if you choose to.